Some men build empires with brick and mortar. Others build them with blood and bullets. Vivian Blake built his with both, and turned two nations into his personal battlefield. In the slums of West Kingston, Jamaica, where corrugated tin roofs rattled under tropical storms and the smell of burning rubber mixed with salt air, a boy named Vivian Blake learned his first lesson. Survival isn't given, it's taken. Born in 1956 in the Tivoli Gardens neighborhood, a place politicians used as their personal army recruitment center, Blake grew up watching politicians hand out food and money before elections, then vanish like smoke when the votes were counted. The ghetto wasn't just poor, it was abandoned, left to rot under the Caribbean sun, while the rich sipped rum on the beaches. His mother worked herself to exhaustion cleaning the homes of wealthy Jamaicans who wouldn't look her in the eye. His father was a shadow, present in name only, absent in every way that mattered. Young Vivian watched the older boys, the rude boys, strutting through the streets with guns tucked into their waistbands, gold chains catching the sunlight, respect following them like loyal dogs. He saw how power worked in Kingston, not through books or hard work, but through fear and loyalty. The government couldn't provide jobs, couldn't fix the roads, couldn't stop the violence, so the gangs became the government. And Vivian Blake was taking notes. In the 1970s, Jamaica was tearing itself apart. The political war between the Jamaica Labour Party, JLP, and the People's National Party, PNP, turned neighborhoods into war zones. Both parties armed their supporters, transforming ghetto youth into militias. Tivoli Gardens belonged to the JLP, and young Blake found himself holding a gun before he could legally drink. He wasn't just a soldier, though. He was a thinker, a planner, someone who understood that politics was theater and violence was the script. While others fought for scraps, Blake was already dreaming bigger. He saw the cocaine flowing through the Caribbean, watched the American money pouring in, and realized something crucial. The real power wasn't in Kingston. It was across the water, in the cities of America, where Jamaican immigrants were settling by the thousands, and where the appetite for powder was insatiable. By his early 20s, Blake had distinguished himself not through reckless violence, but through calculated brutality and undeniable charisma. He was handsome, well-spoken when he needed to be, and absolutely ruthless when crossed. He earned respect, not just through fear, but through competence. He could organize, he could plan, he could turn chaos into profit. And most importantly, he understood loyalty. In the ghetto, your word was your bond, and betrayal was death. Blake took this code and weaponized it, building a crew of young men from Tivoli Gardens who would follow him anywhere, do anything, kill anyone. They called themselves the Shower Posse, not because they cleaned themselves, but because they showered their enemies with bullets. The name itself was a warning, a promise, a brand. When the Shower Posse arrived, bodies would fall like rain. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, Vivian Blake made the move that would transform him from Kingston gangster to international kingpin. He went to America, not as a refugee seeking opportunity, but as a general preparing to conquer new territory. He settled in Brooklyn, New York, in the neighborhoods of Crown Heights and Flatbush, where Jamaican immigrants had created a little Kingston complete with jerk chicken stands, reggae blasting from storefronts, and the familiar yellow, green, and black flags hanging in windows. But Blake wasn't there for nostalgia. He was there for empire. The crack epidemic was just beginning to explode across American cities, and Blake saw the opportunity before most others did. Powder was expensive, elitist, the stuff of Wall Street and Hollywood. But crack, that was democratic, cheap enough for anyone with $10, addictive beyond reason, and profitable beyond imagination. A kilo of powder could be stretched into thousands of rock hits, each one creating a customer who would steal from their own mother for the next high. Blake didn't invent crack, but he perfected its distribution, and he used his Jamaican connections to build a supply chain that stretched from Colombian jungles through Caribbean waters into American streets. The Shower Posse wasn't like the Italian mafia with their rules and codes and respect for civilians. They weren't like the traditional American gangs with their territorial limitations and predictable behavior. The Shower Posse was something new, something terrifying, something American law enforcement had never encountered. They were willing to kill anyone, anywhere, anytime. Witnesses, dead, informants, dead and their families too. Rival dealers, dead and displayed as warnings. Police couldn't flip posse members because the price of betrayal wasn't prison time. It was torture, followed by death, and your mother would watch before they killed her too. Blake established cells across America: New York, Miami, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., Kansas City, Detroit. Each one operating independently, but answering ultimately to him. The structure was brilliant, compartmentalized enough that law enforcement couldn't track the whole organization, but centralized enough that Blake maintained control. Each cell had a leader, usually someone from Tivoli Gardens, someone whose loyalty was proven through blood spilled back in Kingston. They moved powder and crystal, turned it into crack, distributed it through street dealers, collected the money, and sent the profits back to Jamaica through a network of couriers and money laundering operations that involved everything from car dealerships to real estate investments. The money was staggering, millions of dollars weekly, flowing like a river from the pockets of desperate addicts into the coffers of the Shower Posse. Blake lived well: expensive cars, beautiful women, tailored suits. But unlike the flashy gangsters who would eventually fall to federal RICO charges, Blake understood discretion. He kept his name out of the newspapers, avoided the spotlight, operated in the shadows. To the outside world, he was a successful Jamaican businessman. To those who knew, he was a kingpin whose organization was responsible for over 1,400 murders across the United States between 1984 and 1994. And those were just the bodies they found. The Shower Posse's reputation was built on two foundations: efficiency and terror. When they moved into a city, they moved fast and hard, taking over corners with military precision. Established dealers had two choices: work for the posse or die trying to resist. Most chose survival. Those who chose resistance became examples. Their methods were designed to send messages. Bodies weren't just killed, they were displayed. Rivals were found shot execution style, sometimes dozens of times, hence the shower of bullets. Witnesses who spoke to police were hunted down with the kind of determination usually reserved for war criminals. The posse had informants inside police departments, inside courthouses, inside federal buildings. They knew who was talking, who was investigating, who was testifying, and they dealt with each threat with absolute ruthlessness. In Kansas City, when a rival gang tried to push back against posse expansion, the Shower Posse didn't just fight them, they erased them. Multiple murders in a single night, entire crews wiped out, survivors fleeing the city entirely. The message was clear: this territory belongs to us now, and resistance is suicide. In Miami, where the cocaine trade was already violent beyond measure, the Shower Posse somehow managed to be more brutal than everyone else. They shot up nightclubs. They murdered in broad daylight. They killed with a brazenness that shocked even hardened DEA agents. One agent later recalled, "The Jamaican posses were the most violent criminal organizations we'd ever encountered. They made the Colombians look restrained." In Philadelphia, the posse controlled entire neighborhoods, running 24-hour crack houses that generated tens of thousands of dollars daily. Addicts lined up like it was a legitimate business, which in a way it was. Just one that left bodies in its wake. The posse enforced discipline with brutal efficiency. Short on the count? Beaten. Steal from the stash? Dead. Talk to police? Dead, and your family attends your closed casket funeral because there wasn't much left to display. But Blake's true genius wasn't just in violence, it was in organization. He ran the Shower Posse like a corporation. There were accountants who tracked every dollar, enforcers who maintained discipline, distributors who managed supply chains, recruiters who brought in new soldiers from Kingston's ghettos, and lawyers who kept the legal heat manageable. When members were arrested, the posse paid for the best defense attorneys money could buy. When members needed to disappear, the posse had safe houses and escape routes planned. When members were killed, their families back in Jamaica received money and respect. This loyalty system was Blake's secret weapon. Shower Posse members weren't just criminals. They were brothers, bound by blood and shared origins and mutual survival. They came from the same Kingston neighborhoods, knew the same struggles, spoke the same patois, trusted each other in ways that made infiltration nearly impossible. When federal agents tried to flip posse members, they discovered something terrifying. These men would rather spend life in prison than betray their crew, because they knew what betrayal meant: Not just death for themselves, but death for everyone they loved back home. While Blake's empire spread across America, he never forgot Jamaica. In fact, Jamaica was the foundation of everything. Tivoli Gardens wasn't just where he came from. It was his recruiting ground, his safe haven, his seat of power. Blake pumped millions back into the community, not out of charity but out of strategy. He built houses, paid for funerals, provided jobs, handed out food and school supplies. To the residents of Tivoli Gardens, Vivian Blake wasn't a criminal. He was a hero, a man who made it in America and came back to lift up his people. This wasn't altruism, it was empire building. Every dollar Blake spent in Tivoli Gardens bought loyalty. Every house he built created a debt. Every job he provided made someone dependent on his continued success. And that loyalty translated directly into power. When police raided Tivoli Gardens looking for posse members, residents went silent. When witnesses were needed for trials, memories suddenly failed. When Blake needed young men willing to go to America and risk everything for the organization, hundreds volunteered. The relationship between the Shower Posse and Jamaican politics was complex and corrupt. The JLP, which controlled Tivoli Gardens, benefited from the posse's muscle during election season. In exchange, the posse enjoyed a certain level of protection from Jamaican law enforcement. Politicians needed the garrison communities to win elections, and the gangs controlled the garrison communities. It was a symbiotic relationship built on violence and mutual benefit. The politicians provided cover. The gangs provided votes and street-level enforcement. Blake understood this system perfectly and exploited it masterfully. He maintained connections with high-ranking JLP officials, donated to campaigns, helped encourage voter turnout in Tivoli Gardens. In return, when Jamaican police got too close to Shower Posse operations, they would be redirected or reassigned. When extradition requests came from the United States, they would mysteriously stall in Jamaica's bureaucratic system. Blake had built a shield of corruption and loyalty that made him nearly untouchable in his homeland. But even in Jamaica, Blake maintained his code of terror. Rivals who tried to move against him found themselves dead in the streets of Kingston. Informants disappeared into the hills, never to be seen again. The Shower Posse controlled significant portions of Kingston's criminal underworld. Not all of it, but enough to ensure that anyone considering a move against Blake would have to think twice, 3 times, and ultimately decide it wasn't worth the bloodshed. In the late 1980s, at the height of his power, Vivian Blake was essentially running a transnational criminal empire that spanned 2 countries and generated hundreds of millions of dollars. In America, his organization controlled crack distribution in multiple major cities. In Jamaica, he was a power broker with political connections and street-level authority. He lived between both worlds, traveling on fake documents, always one step ahead of law enforcement, always calculating his next move. But empires, no matter how powerful, eventually crack. The Shower Posse's violence, which had been their greatest strength, became their greatest vulnerability. You can only leave so many bodies before law enforcement makes you priority number 1. And in the mid-1980s, as crack devastated American cities and the murder rate exploded, the federal government decided that the Jamaican posses had to be destroyed. The DEA, FBI, and ATF launched coordinated investigations across multiple cities. They called it Operation Rum Punch, a massive multi-agency effort specifically targeting the Shower Posse and other Jamaican criminal organizations. Federal agents worked with local police, built RICO cases, flipped lower-level members, traced money flows, and slowly, painstakingly, began mapping the structure of Blake's empire. The investigation was unprecedented in scope. Agents traveled to Jamaica, interviewed victims, coordinated with Jamaican authorities, the few who weren't corrupt, and built a case that spanned multiple jurisdictions and included hundreds of murders. They used wiretaps, surveillance, informants, and financial forensics. They pressured arrested posse members, offering reduced sentences in exchange for testimony. Some accepted, knowing they were signing their own death warrants, but preferring life in witness protection to decades in maximum security prisons. In 1988, federal indictments came down like thunder. Dozens of Shower Posse members were arrested simultaneously across the United States. The coordinated raids were designed to prevent anyone from fleeing or destroying evidence. Safe houses were raided, stash houses emptied, money and weapons seized. The federal government announced they had broken the back of the Shower Posse, that the most violent criminal organization in America was finished. They were wrong. Blake himself wasn't among those arrested. He had seen the walls closing in and had fled to Jamaica, where his political connections and the slow pace of extradition proceedings would keep him safe, at least temporarily. From Kingston, he tried to maintain control of his American operations, but with so many lieutenants in federal custody, the empire began to fragment. Individual cells started operating independently, some maintaining the Shower Posse name and methods, others splintering off into new organizations. For several years, Blake lived in a strange limbo. He couldn't return to America without being arrested immediately, but he also couldn't truly run his empire from Jamaica. The money was still flowing, but not like before. The violence continued, but without central coordination. The Shower Posse was still dangerous, still active, but no longer the unified machine it had been under Blake's direct control. In Jamaica, Blake maintained his lifestyle and his connections. He was too valuable to the politicians to be handed over easily, and the extradition process was deliberately slow. Years passed. The American government kept up the pressure, but Jamaica's legal system moved at its own pace, complicated by corruption, political considerations, and the sheer complexity of extradition law. In 1994, after years of legal wrangling, political pressure, and diplomatic negotiations, Vivian Blake was finally arrested by Jamaican authorities and extradited to the United States. The man who had once commanded an empire that stretched across multiple cities and 2 nations arrived in America in chains, facing charges that included continuing criminal enterprise, drug trafficking, murder conspiracy, and racketeering. The trial was a spectacle. Federal prosecutors presented a case that detailed the scope and brutality of the Shower Posse's operations. Witnesses testified about murders, torture, the mechanics of crack distribution, the money laundering operations, the corruption of public officials. They presented wiretap evidence of Blake giving orders, financial records showing millions in drug proceeds, and testimony from former posse members who had flipped to save themselves. Blake's defense tried to argue that he was merely a businessman, that he couldn't be held responsible for the actions of autonomous criminals who happened to come from the same neighborhood. But the evidence was overwhelming. The RICO statute, specifically designed to take down organized crime bosses who insulated themselves from direct participation in crimes, was perfectly suited for Blake's case. He didn't need to pull the trigger himself. He ran the organization that pulled thousands of triggers. The jury deliberated and returned with guilty verdicts on multiple counts. The judge, in sentencing Blake, called him one of the most dangerous criminals ever to operate in the United States, noting that the Shower Posse's body count exceeded that of many serial killers and terrorist organizations. Vivian Blake was sentenced to 28 years in federal prison, a term designed to ensure he would be an old man before he tasted freedom again, if he survived prison at all. For Blake, prison was the ultimate humiliation. The man who had lived like a king, who had commanded armies, who had corrupted politicians and terrorized cities, was now just another number in the federal prison system. No more tailored suits, no more beautiful women, no more power, no more respect. Just concrete and steel and the endless monotony of captivity. But even in prison, Blake's legend continued to grow. In Jamaica, he was still remembered as a Robin Hood figure by some, a villain by others, but always with a grudging respect for the empire he had built. In America, law enforcement used the Shower Posse case as a template for fighting other transnational criminal organizations, learning from both their successes in bringing Blake down and their failures in preventing the posse from operating for so long. The question everyone asked was, did the Shower Posse die with Blake's imprisonment? The answer was complicated. As a unified organization under Blake's leadership, yes, it effectively ended. But as a brand, a methodology, a cultural force, it continued in various forms. Other Jamaican posses continued operating. The Spanglers, the Dunkirk Boys, the Jungle Posse, many of them led by former Shower Posse members or inspired by their methods. The violence decreased somewhat, as did the organizational sophistication. But the basic model remained: Jamaican criminals leveraging transnational connections, ruthless violence, and tight-knit loyalty to control crack distribution in American cities. In Jamaica, Tivoli Gardens remained a garrison community, still politically volatile, still producing young men willing to take criminal risks for economic opportunity. In 2010, the Jamaican government launched a military operation to arrest Christopher Dudas Coke, a Tivoli Gardens Don who had taken over much of the territory Blake once influenced. The operation resulted in dozens of deaths and exposed how little had fundamentally changed in the dynamics between politics, poverty, and crime in Jamaica's garrison communities. The crack epidemic that the Shower Posse helped fuel eventually receded, replaced by other epidemics. But the damage was done. Entire communities had been devastated. Hundreds of thousands of Americans had become addicts. The prison system had exploded with non-violent offenders, and the cycle of poverty and crime had been reinforced in ways that would take generations to address. The federal government declared victory, pointing to Blake's conviction and the dismantling of the Shower Posse's leadership structure. But anyone who lived through the crack era knew the truth. They had cut off one head of the Hydra, and others had grown in its place. The Shower Posse was a symptom, not the disease. The disease was poverty, lack of opportunity, political corruption, America's insatiable appetite for narcotics, and the brutal efficiency of free market capitalism applied to illegal commodities. In November 2010, after serving 16 years of his 28-year sentence, Vivian Blake was released from federal prison. He was immediately deported to Jamaica, returning to the island as a 54-year-old man who had been away from the streets for nearly 2 decades. The Jamaica he returned to was different in some ways. Cell phones, internet, a more modern economy. But fundamentally the same in others. Tivoli Gardens was still Tivoli Gardens. The garrison politics still dominated. Poverty still drove young men toward criminal enterprise. Blake returned quietly, without fanfare, without the army of followers that once surrounded him. His release came with conditions. He was to stay away from criminal activity, report regularly to authorities, and essentially live as a regular citizen. For a man who had once commanded a criminal empire, this was a strange and humbling reality. In interviews, Blake presented himself as a reformed man, someone who regretted the violence, who wanted to help steer young Jamaicans away from the path he had taken. He spoke about starting youth programs, about creating legitimate business opportunities, about breaking the cycle of garrison violence. Some believed him. Others saw it as the careful performance of a man who knew he was being watched, who understood that any hint of criminal activity would send him back to prison. The truth, as always, was probably somewhere in between. Blake was undoubtedly older, tired, perhaps genuinely reflective about the blood-soaked empire he had built. But he was also a survivor, someone who had navigated the most dangerous criminal waters and emerged alive. Whether he was truly reformed or simply more cautious, only time would tell. On March 3, 2010, several months before Blake's release, Vivian Blake died of kidney failure at University Hospital in Kingston, Jamaica. He was 53 years old. The man who had survived gang wars, evaded law enforcement for years, and lived through federal prison, was ultimately killed by his own failing body. His death was reported in Jamaican newspapers with a strange mix of reverence and condemnation. Some remembered him as a community figure who had helped Tivoli Gardens. Others remembered him as a monster responsible for countless deaths. Both were true. Blake was a product of his environment, but he was also an architect of immense violence and suffering. In America, his death barely made the news. The Shower Posse was history, the crack epidemic was over, and new criminal organizations had taken center stage. But for those who lived through the 1980s and 1990s, for the families of the 1,400+ murder victims attributed to the Shower Posse, for the communities devastated by crack addiction, Vivian Blake's name still carried weight. His legacy is complicated and dark. He proved that a kid from Kingston's slums could build a transnational empire, that intelligence and ruthlessness could overcome poverty and lack of opportunity. But he also proved that such empires are built on corpses, that the price of power is paid in blood. Not just the blood of enemies, but the blood of communities, families, innocents caught in the crossfire. The Shower Posse pioneered methods that other criminal organizations would adopt. Extreme violence as a business strategy, transnational networks leveraging immigrant communities, compartmentalized cell structures that resisted law enforcement penetration, and the use of political corruption as a shield. These weren't innovations in the technical sense. Organized crime has always used these tactics, but the Shower Posse refined them and applied them with a level of brutality that shocked even experienced law enforcement. Today, Tivoli Gardens still stands, still produces young men with limited options and dangerous dreams. The drugs still flow through Caribbean waters into American cities. The cycle continues, fed by demand and desperation, by poverty and politics, by the same forces that created Vivian Blake and the Shower Posse. Who was Vivian Blake really? Beyond the empire, beyond the violence, beyond the legend? He was a product of garrison politics, a system that weaponized poverty and loyalty for political gain. He was a businessman who applied corporate logic to criminal enterprise. He was a community figure who provided for his neighborhood while destroying communities across America. He was ruthless and charismatic, intelligent and brutal, calculating and impulsive. Those who knew him described him as charming when he needed to be, terrifying when crossed. He could discuss politics and philosophy, then order a murder without hesitation. He maintained relationships with high-ranking politicians while commanding street-level enforcers. He was a father and a killer, a provider and a destroyer. In some ways, Blake embodied the contradictions of late 20th century capitalism. The idea that anyone can rise from poverty to wealth through determination and hard work, conveniently ignoring the bodies left behind. He was the American dream twisted into a nightmare, the self-made man whose product was addiction and death. His story is inseparable from the larger story of the crack epidemic, which devastated Black and Latino communities across America, while generating billions in profits for criminal organizations, and eventual billions more for the prison industrial complex. Blake didn't create the demand for crack. American poverty, racism, and despair did that. But he was extraordinarily effective at meeting that demand and profiting from it. The Shower Posse was also part of the larger story of Jamaica's political violence, the garrison communities, the weaponization of poverty by politicians who armed young men and then abandoned them once elections were over. Blake emerged from this system, exploited it, and ultimately became one of its most successful exports, along with reggae music, jerk chicken, and Olympic sprinters. Jamaica also exported criminal enterprises that would terrorize American cities. In the end, what can be said about Vivian Blake and the Shower Posse? They were one of the most violent criminal organizations in American history, responsible for over 1,400 murders and the distribution of tons of crack that destroyed countless lives. They operated with a level of brutality and sophistication that law enforcement had never encountered before. They proved that transnational criminal enterprises could operate successfully for years, generating hundreds of millions in profits while avoiding prosecution. But they were also a symptom of deeper systemic failures. Political corruption in Jamaica, the American war on drugs creating massive profit opportunities for criminal enterprises, poverty creating desperate young men willing to risk everything, and the fundamental inequality that makes criminal enterprise an attractive alternative to legitimate opportunity. Vivian Blake died in a hospital bed, his kidneys failing, his empire long gone, his legend intact but his body broken. The Shower Posse died with him, fragmenting into smaller, less organized entities that lacked his vision and organizational genius. The streets that once trembled at the mention of the Shower Posse moved on, finding new threats, new gangs, new violence. But the blueprint remained, the methods remained, the lessons remained. Somewhere in Kingston's slums, another young man is watching, learning, planning. He sees the poverty around him, the broken promises of politicians, the lack of legitimate opportunity. He sees the older men with money and respect and power. He sees the same lessons that Vivian Blake learned in Tivoli Gardens decades ago. And the cycle continues. Because the Shower Posse wasn't just a criminal organization. It was a response to systemic failure, a twisted form of entrepreneurship, a violent manifestation of the American dream filtered through Caribbean poverty and political corruption. Blake is dead. The Shower Posse is history. But the conditions that created them, the poverty, the politics, the demand for stuff, the inequality, those remain. Different faces, different names, different organizations, but the same fundamental dynamics. That's Vivian Blake's true legacy. Not just the empire he built, not just the bodies he left behind, but the proof that the system itself is broken, that it creates monsters and calls them criminals, while ignoring the conditions that made them. Some men are born into poverty and accept their fate. Some fight against it through legitimate means. But a few, a dangerous few, decide to burn the whole system down and build their empire on the ashes. Vivian Blake wasn't just a criminal. He was a businessman who understood that in a world without opportunity, violence becomes currency and fear becomes power. He didn't invent the game, he just played it better than anyone else, until the game played him back. The Shower Posse is gone. But somewhere in Kingston, in Brooklyn, in Miami, a new crew is forming, learning from Blake's success and his failures, ready to shower their enemies with bullets and their neighborhoods with blood money. Because as long as poverty exists, as long as the stuff flows, as long as the system creates more victims than opportunities, there will always be someone willing to become the monster the streets created. And the rain of bullets falls eternal.